This is Heather B. Moore. I'm with my father, officially S. Kent Brown. I'm excited to be able to talk to him today about the last week of Christ's life. He is a biblical scholar, and also I'm just going to share very short bio. His bio is probably 10 pages long, but this will only be one paragraph. So, S. Kent Brown is an emeritus professor of ancient scripture at BYU and the former director of the BYU Jerusalem Center for Near Eastern Studies. In the world of documentary films, he was the executive producer for Journey of Faith, also Journey of Faith, The New World, and Messiah, Behold the Lamb of God. His most recent book, or books, I will say, is a commentary called The Testimony of Luke. It's around 1,100 pages. 1,200 pages. And also recently released is the Epistle to the Ephesians, and this is much shorter, below 1,000 pages, right?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, I have read.
I couldn't find enough to write about.
I've read parts of them, not every single word of both books, but he's also written quite a few other books on different subjects of scriptural text. But anyway, say hi to all of our listeners and viewers. The nice thing about my dad is he is 30 years older than me, and my middle daughter is 30 years younger than me. So I always know his age, and I always remember the year he was born, as long as I know my age and the year I was born, right?
Yes.
Basically, we're just going to talk about kind of what happened during the week.
I'll tell you an experience. I was in the old city of Jerusalem on an occasion talking with a man who was an official of another faith in the city. He had spent a year in New York City at one point in his life, and he said, "You Americans do a wonderful job on Christmas, but not so good on Easter." He knew the difference between the Easter celebration as we celebrate it, what we'd say the West, and how you celebrate it in the East. And the East is always much, much bigger deal. For instance, for Palm Sunday, which was last Sunday, in the Western calendar, it's this coming Sunday in the Eastern calendar. But last week, a group of people gathered on the Mount of Olives in the place called Bethphage, which is just on the east side of the crest. They gathered there, their Boy Scout troops and Girl Scout troops from local churches. There are officials there and so on. The most impressive group are the Franciscans, who create a rectangle with their bodies and walk up over the top of the Mount of Olives. Then they go down a road that takes them down past traditional Gethsemane, up the hill into Lion's Gate. It's a wonderful experience, and those of us who have been there treasure our memories of participating. So that's how they replicate the trek of Christ as he comes across the Mount of Olives, down into the Kidron Valley, up the other side, and into the city. According to Luke, when he arrived after almost a full day's walk up from Jericho, a distance of 15 miles, Jesus went into the temple and began to turn over tables and make a general ruckus. What's miraculous about that scene is that he was not arrested, because for festivals, the Romans had a garrison in a place that was called the fortress, the Antonia Fortress, which was on the northwest corner of the temple complex. And on the top of all these porches that surrounded the temple complex were spaced Roman soldiers. And they kept watch on what was going on down below them so that nothing untoward would happen. And the idea was that if some big thing broke out, Roman soldiers stationed in the Antonia fortress would descend the steps, coming out a doorway, an arched doorway that led right into the temple grounds, push their way, not gently, of course, they'd push their way to wherever the trouble was and stop it. And nobody did that when Jesus came and made trouble. That's actually the second miracle of the day. The first one occurred up on top of the Mount of Olives in Bethphage when Jesus sent a couple of his disciples ahead of him. They came to a residence that had an enclosure around it, and there was this donkey. Mm-hmm. And they untied the donkey. The owner said, "Hey, what's going on?" They said, "The Lord has need of it." Okay. So they brought the donkey to Jesus, who was young. The donkey was young and had not been ridden. You would expect that when Jesus climbs on his back, this whole thing would go crazy and try to throw him off, but it didn't. Instead, it remained under him and carried him the rest of the way over the crest of the mount, down the slope, across the Kidron Valley, and up to the city.
So did he ride a donkey because of the distance, or because it was part of the triumphal entry?
That's a very perceptive question. There is in Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 9, a prophecy that the coming one would ride into the city on a donkey. Mm-hmm. And it looks like Jesus does this partially in fulfillment of that prophecy. So he's also hailed by the crowd as the coming one. And the coming one is a rich theme throughout the Old Testament of the one who is expected. And so he comes as the coming one. One more little thing, if you're okay with me to go on here. When he comes across the top, there's this crowd that have followed him up the hill since Jericho. And they begin to sing and shout, and they're carrying palm fronds and so on. Nowadays, you can buy a palm frond from a little enterprising kid who'll sell it to you for $1. But they were singing and shouting and so on, carrying on. And somebody said, "Master, make these people be quiet." And he says something like, "If they were to be silent, the rocks would cry out." The idea was that if humans wouldn't recognize their king, nature would. So after, you're just going to let me go on here. So after Jesus creates this trouble inside the temple, is unarrested, he leaves, goes back up over the top of the mountain. That's a big climb. Up over the top of the Mount of Olives again, down to Bethany. That's where he is located for much of the week. He and his disciples do spend time, apparently, part of that week in a cave, which had been enlarged and fixed for olive processing at the base of the Mount of Olives. It seems to be in that place that he and his disciples had gone, and that's where Judas knows to look for him when he leads the crowd looking for Jesus. Jesus, of course, was not back in the cave. He was out in the garden under the trees. You also have to know, if you're up early this morning, you would have noticed this moon, big moon in the west. It's a full moon. Passover was 2 days ago, the beginning of it. And it's the Passover moon. I know there are those who call it the pink moon. I say, not before it was a Passover moon. So whatever happens that night when the arresting party comes with Judas takes place in the full light of the moon.
And isn't Passover connected with this moon, and that's why this date changes a little bit every year?
Right. Okay. It's the first full moon after spring equinox. So equinox comes, and then the next full moon is Passover, and the next Sunday is Easter.
Okay.
So Passover, we're in the middle of Passover now, and Easter comes on Sunday. Palm Sunday is a very important day. Jesus was in Jericho through Saturday. He arrives in Jericho Friday afternoon, stays in the home of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. Then he's there all day Saturday. You can imagine what that was like for him and his family. And then he comes up the hill, and Luke writes that he went before, which must mean that he pushed the pace. So that when he gets up to Bethphage and close to Bethphage and sends his disciples, they come up behind him, breathing hard. It's actually steeper than that. Once you get to the back of the Mount of Olives, it's a steep climb. But he was pushing the pace.
So we have him on Sunday is when he is a triumphal entry and the cleansing of the table. Then he retreats to Bethany.
Right, goes back to Bethany.
And then what's the distance between Bethany and Jerusalem that he's going back and forth every day?
Correct. One of the things that the Gospels don't help us with, that remains undiscussed, are the mikveh baths that surround the city. Mm-hmm. They've been excavated, so we know that there are several around the city. And when a person comes from afar, which means more than 17 miles away from the city, and they come to the city, they're supposed to go into a mikveh bath and rinse off the impurities of the road, and also the fact that they've been living away from the holy center. And I have no idea whether Jesus and those who came with him into the city had gone into a mikveh bath. I assume so. So they're at least mostly wet when they arrive on this day. That's probably not a good thing to think about, but that the Gospel of John, chapter 11, one of the last verses, it's verse 55, talks about people coming early to the city, typically a week early, for purification reasons.
So that was not only religious tradition, but also because they're traveling.
Yes. Other countries in the Old Testament are called fathers of impurity. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting line that comes out of Hosea and other writers, but they're called fathers of impurity. The idea was that if I'm a Jew who lives farther away than 17 miles, for me to enter the city, I am obliged to go into a mikveh bath and rinse off the impurities that adhere to me because of where I live.
Mm-hmm.
And then I can go into the city now prepared, purified in a proper way. If I go into the temple, at the gate of the temple, there's standing a Levite, and he has a sprig of, I think it's an olive branch with a container, and the container has a an aroma in its contents. Plus, it also has in it some of the blood from a heifer. It's a red heifer which is sacrificed up on top of the Mount of Olives before the festival begins, a good few days before it begins. That there also is blood dropped in there. And as I walk into the temple at one of its gates, there stands a Levite who flicks this water on me, which has the religious symbolism of cleansing me, not just to come into the holy city, but now to come inside the holy temple. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I'm picturing all these people have gathered for Passover week, and Jesus is staying outside of the city. I'm sure there's a lot of people also camping outside the city because there's so many people there.
Yes.
But every time they enter through the gates, they're going through these symbolic cleansing rituals.
They only do it. They only
whole
do it once. They only
Okay.
do it the first time they come to the city. Then
Okay.
they're considered okay. Even if they go back out to a camping spot, say in the Kidron Valley or someplace else.
Because it's within that 17-mile radius.
That's right. It's within the 17-mile radius. It's the city. The city that sets the standard is one called Modi'in, Modiin, Modi'in, which lies west and a little north of the city on the descent to what is now Tel Aviv, on one of the roads that goes down to Tel Aviv.
Okay.
So
that's Sunday, and then Monday is traditionally teaching at the temple and maybe the widow's mite.
Right. There are 5 major scenes that the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, preserve from Jesus first, or from his week in the temple. One is the challenge to his authority. Mm-hmm. He's teaching. People come to him who are nasty-minded, demand to know where he gets his authority, because they know that he has not studied with the rabbi. He has not studied with a learned man, as Paul will a few years later. And so they wonder where he gets his authority to teach. And you might recall, he says, well, I'll ask you a question. And he asks them, the baptism of John, was it of God or not? And of course they dither, and they say, well, we can't tell. And he says, well, of course I can't tell you where my authority comes from. They're unwilling to admit that John might have been sent by God to do what he did. There's also the famous question that comes up of the Sadducees. The Sadducees probably threw this thing up to the Pharisees all the time. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, whereas the Pharisees did. There's this couple, young man, young woman, they marry. Oh, he suddenly dies. So his next brother marries her, and he suddenly dies. And so on till the 7th brother. And finally, the 7th brother dies. And whose is she in the resurrection? Well, the Sadducees don't give a fig about the resurrection, but they've made up this kind of weird story to tie Pharisees in knots trying to explain this. And of course, Jesus responds that God is the God of the living, not of the dead. So with that answer, it's clear that the first husband and she belong together. And it's not, even though she has been married in what's called a levirate marriage situation, even though she's been married to all the brothers, in eternity, she and the oldest brother are together.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's also this thing about David and the Lord that comes to him. There's a question about do we pay taxes to Caesar or not? All of these little stories are pulled out of these days that he's in the temple. Then comes this one, probably on Wednesday, where you mentioned the temple and the widow with the two coins. They're called leptas, Lepta, with the English S meaning plural. So he and his disciples were in what's called the Court of Women. It's basically a square courtyard, large. There are signs in front of the gate going into it that in several languages say Gentiles are not welcome here. So only Jewish people go in. And around the edges of this big enclosure are 13 chests. They're labeled. There are labels on these things so that you know that if you put money in this chest, it'll go for the maintenance of the temple. If you put money in this chest, it goes for the construction of the temple. The temple is still under construction and had been by that point for almost 50 years. And there are other here's one for the poor and so on. Something for the maintenance of the priest families. And that the disciples are impressed with these people who come in with all this. They put in jewelry, they put in coins, things of value. They're impressed. Plus, right next to them, stretching into the sky for over 100 feet, is the facade of the temple, which was spectacular. It may have been the most impressive building in the ancient world of that day. It was covered with a facade of white marble. It glistened in the sun. It was amazing. And Jesus' disciples, many of whom had made their livings by fishing, are really, really impressed. But Jesus isn't looking at that and those other people. He's watching this little woman come into the temple, this widow woman, and he draws attention to her. After she casts in these 2 mites, we call them widow's mites, and he said that she had cast in more than they all. He has a sense of her bare closet, of her bare shelves, including not much on the shelf to eat for her and her children, how many ever are still in her home. He knows of her bare bed, which has been made empty by death, and that she sleeps alone, and so on. He sees all of this, and his heart goes out to her. It's after that scene that he and the disciples climb the Mount of Olives,
Mhm.
overlooking the city. You can still go to where I think the place really was, except now you can't see through the walls. There are big walls there to form barriers for the property. But in antiquity, you could sit there on the top of the mount and look down onto the city and this gorgeous, gorgeous temple. And that's where he gives the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. We actually have 7 copies of this sermon, which shows its importance. And I am convinced that there is no one right version or less right version. I accept all of them as scriptural. So we have Matthew, Mark, Luke. We also have Joseph Smith translation, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and section 45 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Those 7 documents give us insight into what Jesus was interested in talking about upon the Mount. So that's Wednesday. Thursday evening, by my calculation, I know there are some who believe that Wednesday evening was the time of the Last Supper. I happen to believe it occurred on Thursday, Passover time. That's the Last Supper. He gathers with his 12 most beloved faithful servants, served in that meal by the women who came from Galilee, who accompanied them. They've been with them, they've been with the 12 for all these months and a bigger, larger group of disciples. Luke mentions them way back in chapter 8 of his gospel, and he names some of them, including Mary Magdalene, out of whom went 7 devils, Luke writes. So these women, I think, are the ones who prepared and served the meal. Yes, Jesus gave responsibility to Peter and John to go get the meal ready and so on, but those women are not going to let those guys touch that meal. They're going to take care of things. Their affection for this man and his followers is of such a character that they're going to make sure that everything is precisely as it should be for this meal. So they prepare it, apparently in some kind of an auxiliary kitchen. They roast the lamb. That's something that John and Peter can take care of. They buy the lamb. They take it into the temple for its ritual slaughtering. They cut off the hide. They roast the lamb in one of the ovens around the city, and then they take the hide to the guy who owns the property. That in effect is the rental payment, the hide of the lamb, and then the meat is all prepared by roasting it in one of these ovens. But the women take care of the rest, and they're unspoken about. You don't hear about them, but they surely are there, helping with this meal. Who else would do it? It's those women who are so attached to the Savior, who made certain things were taken care of. So they go through the Passover meal. By the way, the Passover meal is the only meal whose time is determined. Every other meal can be any time, breakfast anytime, lunch anytime, whatever. But the Passover meal starts after sundown.
Mhm.
That's the one that there's a passage in Leviticus that mentions this, and Israelites and Jews ever after always started their meal after sundown. And then the whole thing about the liturgy, as we would call it, or the Haggadah. I'm sorry, excuse me. The whole thing about the Haggadah would go from there, and they would tell the story of the Israelites coming out of Egypt. Now, as you know from your own experience, having been in more than one of these Seder, what we call Seder meals,
Mm-hmm.
the whole story that's told with a meal has to do with the departure of the Hebrew slaves from Egypt. But it's as though you and I are there, that we actually were part of the crowd that came
Right.
out of Egypt, and we experienced this thing firsthand. All of that is missing in the gospel accounts. You
Mm-hmm.
don't get any sense that the disciples who are reclining, by the way, at Passover, everybody reclines because that's how free people eat meals. They eat them reclining. They don't sit on a chair or a bench. They recline as though they're free and they're expecting no problems. So,
They don't have to hurry and run somewhere and escape an army.
yeah, there's no reason to think of needing to escape. So, and that was the way it was with these Israelite slaves. But there's no hint of this kind of thing until you come to the Joseph Smith translation. And the Joseph Smith translation quotes Jesus as saying something like, "When you do this again, you will remember this night that I spent with you," and so on. And there it is. There, the next time they prepare a sacramental offering, as we do in our sacrament meetings,
Mm-hmm.
that very next time they'll remember. And it will be as if they were with him on that occasion. And the next time, and the next time, and the next time. So that I've thought about this, and occasionally when it occurs to me, I think about what it must have been like in that upper room with the Savior, with those disciples, with those faithful women, and being there as he changes this bread, the unleavened bread, into the bread of that celebrates his body, and the third cup of wine into the blood that celebrates his body, symbolically, of course. Why do I say third cup? Because Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which includes a description of what happened at the Last Supper, he says, after they had supped, that is, after the meal, they drink 4 cups of wine at the meal. One at its beginning, once during the meal, once right after the meal, and it's after they had supped. After the meal is finished, it was the third cup of wine. And that's the one that he blesses and passes around, asking them each to take a sip. Well, they each had their own cups. He could have just poured it out and blessed it, and then they could have partaken. No, he insisted that he bless the cup and he pass it around, and everybody partakes from the same one. But the idea planted in the JST, I think it's both in Matthew and in Mark, that you will remember this night. And that's the memorializing of the experience, like Passover memorialized the escape from Egypt.
Which then that takes us into Thursday late night and Friday early morning.
Right. So I suspect that that they were in the upper room till 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night, both with the Passover service and with a conversation that goes on. John gives us quite a bit that Jesus said on that occasion, so it could have been 11 o'clock before they leave. One of the Gospels tells us that they sang a hymn. What they're doing is they're singing the Hallel songs, the Hallel Psalms, Psalms. They are Psalms 113 to 118. They've already heard them earlier that day over at the temple when the lambs were being slaughtered. There is a Levitical choir that sings its way through those 6 psalms, and then they start over and they sing their way through those 6 psalms again. And tradition has it that they would reach almost the second time they would finish the 6 psalms as they sang together before people ran out of lambs to prepare. But they sing the psalms. They then leave the upper room, which is must be up on the upper west side. I've seen art which tries to show Jesus and the 12 gathered around the table, and there are cracks in the walls of behind them, and I think, wait a minute, this is a classy place. The owner of this place doesn't allow plaster cracks. If something develops, he has it repaired. So I think that's a bit misleading. They then leave. They go down through a shallow valley. We don't know whether they went south, way down below, and then came up the Kidron Valley. There's a gate down there where the Hinnom Valley and the Kidron Valley join. There's a gate right there, lets you out of the walls. Or if they went around the north side of the temple grounds, down into the Kidron Valley and up to Gethsemane. It's much shorter that way. So they go to Gethsemane. And of course, everybody, I think, knows the meaning of the name. And it means olive press, right? And as I mentioned earlier on, there was this cave that had been given some reshaping, which a person could go into, and it was much warmer in there than it was outside in the winter. But that's where they processed olives from the trees nearby. And there apparently was some kind of an entryway into this garden area. It's really an orchard of olive trees. And Jesus leaves 8. Judas has already abandoned them. He leaves 8 at the gate, takes 3 with him, tells them to sit here, watch, pray, and then he goes farther into the orchard. And the verbs are interesting in this setting because they describe his actions, that he went forward, fell, and prayed. Those are the actions we're told he took. The tense of the verbs there is what we call the imperfect, which means that they have to do with customary or iterative action. The sense is he went forward, fell, and prayed. He went forward, fell, and prayed. He went forward, fell, and prayed. It's almost like an athlete who, in the height of an event, when you need to call upon all your reserves and all of your strength and skills, but this is the point in the race, this is the point in the contest where you begin to feel the most pain, where the exertion is almost overwhelming. And the athlete tries to adjust his or her body ever so slightly to make the pain go away, or at least ease the pain in some way. And it's almost like Jesus is trying to find a way to ease the pain because it dropped on him like a big load of bricks. The pain of our sins, our mistakes, our transgressions all fell onto him basically in the same moment. The suffering, of course, would be repeated again once he went to the cross. That's an insight that comes from Talmage's book, Jesus the Christ, that the pains of Gethsemane came back to him on the cross. How long he was there, we don't know. The Joseph Smith translation of Matthew and Mark both say something like, when the disciples had finished their sleeping, right, ended their sleeping, as though they were there for 5 or 6 hours in the garden, sleeping, resting, while Jesus was, during that time, of course, suffering. And then comes, before the dawn, then comes Judas and the arresting party. The scene painted in John's gospel is almost comical. Jesus asks, "Whom seekest thou?" "Well, Jesus of Nazareth," somebody says. "I am he." And they all fell back. And you have to understand, these people had heard of his reputation, that he had powers that nobody else had. And I suspect every soldier who came with Judas and their leaders was afraid that Jesus might turn his power on them and do something, injure them, maybe even hospitalize them, kill them. They had no idea what to expect, but they had heard stories. So I expect that when Jesus says, "I am he," the guys who were closest to him took a step back and they stepped on the foot of the person who was right behind them. And they, of course, are pulling back and they step on the foot of the next person behind, and the two of them go down in a heap. And that happened basically around this whole crowd. Mm-hmm. Well, we're told, only John preserves this detail, that Jesus was bound and then he's taken off. And they surely must have gone down the Kidron Valley, down to the place where there was a gate, the one I mentioned earliest. Then they came up a long set of steps that were, there's still remnants of the staircase. You can see it now. The staircase comes from the Roman times. They come up this staircase to the high priest's home. Actually, there are 2 high priests that live in the same house. As you know from living among people in the Middle East, the parents typically have the lowest level, Actually, the lowest level, if you can afford it, is for the animals. Then the parents, then the next child, then the next child, then the next child. You get up to 5 stories or so where you house most of your children. And at this point, there was a high priest and his retired father-in-law who were living in the same building. So they didn't have far to come when Jesus is brought into the residence. He's actually not brought up into the residence. He's kept in the lower part. And then they have to send out people to others of the Sanhedrin or the leading lights in the city to come and join them. They're all, of course, fast asleep because they've just eaten a few hours before that, their Passover meal. So they have to be awakened and brought to the high priest's home where the hearing takes place. I expect by the time people get there at 6 or 6:30 in the morning. It could have been a little earlier, maybe by as early as 5. But they hold this hearing. They decide that Jesus is guilty of sedition and so on. So off they go to Pilate. Now, Pilate's across town. He's in a palace that was originally built by Herod the Great, and that's where he stays when he comes to the city for special occasions. So you can imagine this guy. He's probably had a wonderful meal the night before, and they drank a lot of wine and so on, and he's catching up on his sleep, and bang, bang, bang on the gates of the palace. And here come the chief priests and their friends, and they want Pilate to pass a verdict on Jesus. What's interesting to me is from the accounts you learn that Pilate, and in his turn Herod Antipas, to whom Pilate sends or he sends Jesus, the two of them say that in their interviews with Jesus, they could find nothing that warranted anything more than just a beating and a dismissal. And so they represent Rome. Rome's judgment in all of this is that Jesus is not guilty, that he is an innocent man, and it's only the Jewish authorities who press. Mm-hmm. And of course, they press, they get the crowd that's there with them to start shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." There's a guy who's in custody of the Romans named Barabbas, who is a known nasty person who has killed and has burglarized and all kinds of other things. They finally caught him, have him in custody, and Pilate says, "Well, whom do you want then? Do you want this innocent man, Jesus of Nazareth, or do you want Barabbas?" Because he had a deal, the Romans had a deal with the Jews that they would release a prisoner at the Passover. And of course, they all cry for Barabbas to be released. Bad choice. But he was released and Jesus was kept. I imagine in my head Jesus sitting, where now probably he's been moved from the palace over to where the soldiers are bivouacked in the Antonia fortress, which stands next to, pressing against the temple ground. And the Jesus waits there, and the quartermaster orders the crosspiece on which Jesus will hang. Orders the crosspiece. Soldier brings it, maybe 2 soldiers bring it, and Jesus recognizes the wood because he'd grown up in a home where he had learned from Joseph how to work wood. Joseph is called a carpenter by English translation, but it really means artisan. Joseph was skilled with wood and stone and metal. And I expect that Jesus knew all of that too, that he had grown up as an apprentice. And when the wood is brought in on which he will hang, he recognizes what kind it was. And off they go to Golgotha. As you know, traditional Golgotha sits upon a hill just above what is now called the Garden Tomb. Some friends and I tried to walk in there one time, and we were stopped. We were asked if we were a Muslim. We, of course, had to admit that we were not. It's held by a Muslim concern, so they wouldn't allow us to go up and explore the area up on top. But that's the traditional spot where Jesus was crucified. And one of my enduring memories of going into the Garden Tomb, which is a favorite place for people go when they go to Jerusalem, one of my enduring memories is accompanying President Hinckley when he was first counselor in the first presidency. He had been sent to Jerusalem to inspect the Jerusalem Center. It had been built and was almost ready for dedication. And he came, and of course, everybody was nervous because they knew that President Hinckley was one of those kinds of guys who could see whether or not the line was straight up and down or flat across. So he would have a sense whether the construction had been accurate to what it should have been. And during his brief stay in Jerusalem, I was in the small crowd that went with him over to the Garden Tomb. He was full of questions about it, and I tried to answer, since I was the spokesperson, try to answer as best I could. So we walked out past the Garden Tomb, through the gardens, out east. There's this pathway that walks out east, and it overlooks on one side the bus station, the Arab bus station. On the left side is Golgotha, this hill. And there is sort of cut into the side of the hill, not by artificial means, but by natural erosion of the rock, a couple of what look like to be empty eye sockets and an empty nose socket.
Mm-hmm.
There, and people have thought of that as Golgotha, the place of death. But on the way out, there is down at foot level a little sign that sits right next to the walkway as you go out. And it quotes, I'm going to miss this, I think it's Psalm 133, verse 6. The line is, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem." Mm-hmm. President Hinckley stopped, read it aloud, and then said, I pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Then he walked on. And I thought, well, if he can pray for the peace of Jerusalem, so can I. And I do every day. I pray for the peace of other places too every day, including places where we have lived, like Cairo and Izmir. But Jesus was taken off to be crucified. There he hung on the cross from approximately noon until about 3 o'clock, when he finally expired. Mm. And His last words, according to Joseph Smith's addition to the passage in the Gospel of Matthew, was he said, "It is finished," and died. He, of course, was taken down from the cross, was put into a new tomb. This is where Christians separate from one another. Some believing Garden Tomb is the place where he is put. Some believing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb there, was where he is placed. I find value in visiting them both. It's during that time that his body is in a tomb, that his spirit was still active, and that he went to the spirits in prison. This is section 138 of the Doctrine and Covenants, but it builds on passages in 1 Peter. And in 1 Peter, we learned that Jesus went and preached to the spirits which were in prison. And that's where he went, and according to section 138, he not only went and rescued souls there from their imprisonment, but he also organized a missionary force to go into the place of benighted souls and to preach the gospel to people who hadn't heard the gospel before in their lives. So that's what Jesus did on Saturday after suffering so roughly Friday, almost the whole day Friday. And then, of course, he was resurrected from the dead on Sunday morning, really early. What's interesting to me is about that there was no human witness to Jesus' resurrection. According to Matthew, soldiers were stationed near the tomb to make sure that none of his disciples came by night and spirited away his body, and then claimed later that Jesus had been resurrected. But when the resurrection occurred, we're told there was this crash of thunder, and an angel descended from heaven in bright light, and the soldiers were as if they were dead. They were out. They were out. They were gone. None of them saw anything. Once the first crash of thunder and so on, they were dead to the world. And so Jesus leaves without anybody else seeing him. But the two angels stayed behind to bear witness to the women when they came a while later that this angel rehearsed this line thousands of times. He is not here. He is risen. That's the only thing he had to say that was really, really tremendously important, that he rehearsed that with all of his friends. So the Savior left. There are three solo appearances. We know that he appeared to Peter, and that Peter thereby became the chief guarantor of resurrection. I'll end with this. We know he appeared to Mary Magdalene. John has an extensive account of his appearance to her. And then we also know that he appeared to James, his younger brother. Paul mentions this in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, if somebody wants to check it out. He mentions that he appeared to James, his brother. There is an old gospel, not in the New Testament. We only have tiny fragments of it, It's called the Gospel of the Hebrews. And the fragments come from quotations. There are early Christian authors who read this thing and then they quoted a line or two here or there. According to that account, what has been recovered of the Gospel to the Hebrews is the story that after the resurrection, Jesus went to his younger brother, James, who had been fasting since his crucifixion, and broke bread with him so that his younger brother could break his fast in the presence of his older brother. Ever since I learned that story, I've been touched by it. And I, for one, believe in its authenticity, that it's an authentic account of one of the scenes that followed resurrection. Of course, then there are others like the two persons who are going down to Emmaus. Jesus falls in with them, walks with them. Then later that night, after those guys hustled back to the city, the 10 apostles and others were together, including women, and Jesus taught them through the night. So, time?
So I did have a question, well, probably 50, but I'm only going to ask one. So how long from when Jesus was resurrected to when he ascended to heaven? Like how long was he in his resurrected form on earth?
Well, we know that he spent 40 days with the disciples. This was a long priesthood training session. That's 6 weeks. Most of us complain if we have to go to a meeting for 2 hours. So he is with the disciples for 6 weeks, basically, except for Judas, of course, which is most of the time to reach Pentecost, which is the outpouring of the Spirit in Acts chapter 2. So he was there for a good 6 weeks with the 11.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I've learned a few things, several things. Some of it I feel like is familiar, but maybe I haven't exactly remembered it. And I really liked this last week conference sessions when we were reminded to focus on Easter. So I love that you brought that up in the very beginning about how, especially in some areas of our country, that it just kind of slides by with an Easter bunny and Easter egg hunt. So this has definitely been inspirational for me to hear more about the last week of Christ's life, and also celebrating. I think that tonight is, when he began that process of the atonement, and then tomorrow is when the rest and crucifixion takes place.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, dearest. I appreciate it.